Next speaker, I've great pleasure in introducing to you is Dr. Kay Swinburne, a member of EU's Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee.
It's actually a great pleasure to come here, and it took us a little while to actually find this old building in the middle of all the other buildings around it. But I'm glad to be here, even though I'm a little concerned that actually the number of requests I have to come and speak, particularly in the City of London right now, is actually far exceeding the time I have available. But also I'm really concerned that legislators have become important speakers on the calendars of conference organisers. That suggests to me that we've probably got the balance a little out of kilter right now, because legislators' work is not supposed to be interesting. And so I suspect that some of you will find what I have to say interesting, some of you will probably get annoyed by it on the basis of what's coming down from Brussels. But actually, I think what I would hope to leave you with today is that actually the reason I come out to do events like this is to make sure that the financial services industry itself appreciates that the European political process for legislation is interactive. And therefore, if everybody engage in this process early on, it means that we can end up with what I think are workable and proportionate pieces of legislation that benefit everybody, because the single market is enhanced for financial services. But when I started working on MiFID, which is what I've been asked to talk on today, I started 3 years ago when I actually joined the European Parliament and was elected for the first time. And I decided that actually this was going to be one of the biggest pieces of legislation for the UK because it was due for review this year. And so we actually started work on it with an own initiative report. And I actually managed to write a report on dark pools, which I can tell you there were very few people in the Parliament at the time who actually knew what a dark pool was. And certainly one of the questions we got in the early hearings was whether a dark pool was actually somewhere people laundered money. So we've come a long way, and I can tell you now that the MiFID discussions and papers we have in front of us and what we're working from in the Parliament as a report to negotiate is actually far different from those early discussions 3 years ago. So I hope that it's actually given you a little bit of faith that we can come up a learning curve very quickly, and that not only those of us like myself who have a background in finance, but those who don't have also come to a much greater level of understanding. And I think it's really surprising when you come and look at the markets and you actually hear some of the terminology. And HFT, algos, dark pools, co-location, naked sponsored access, these are all terms that those people working in the industry take for granted. But actually, as legislators, they are often very, very new. And certainly even pre-MiFID, the times when I worked in the equity markets, most of those terms were unheard of. And so the pace of change has been fairly dramatic since MiFID I was implemented. And MiFID I, certainly for the equities world, has created a single market, a single platform. It did away with the old concentration rule, and certainly we're finding now that because of that change in the market structures, we're actually seeing new technologies have emerged. We're certainly seeing that techniques that have previously only made sense in the US markets have now actually moved in huge abundance over here to the European markets. Now, some of these techniques that are actually out there and being used are actually clearly just the automation of what were existing practices and have existed in the markets for years. And many have actually drawn the analogy for me that where the specialist previously stood in the trading pit was really important in terms of the flow of information. And of course, co-location of servers is an extension of the modern day location of your trader. And other practices, obviously, have actually taken place that I genuinely believe have actually made markets better, more efficient, and have driven certainly some of the costs down. So I think there are more efficient price discovery tools in the marketplace now. So not all technology has actually had a detrimental impact. I would say most technology seems to have had a very positive impact upon the way our markets in Europe are working. But as with all new innovations, they've also brought new risks to the system. And I think it's right in the MiFID review that we're currently undergoing that we actually, as legislators, look to address some of those loopholes that potentially have actually emerged. Now, in MiFID II, the Parliament has actually introduced new requirements to mitigate some of these risks of technology. And many of them have been identified with respect to high-frequency trading strategies. And HFT, to many, has become a fairly bad word within the Parliament. But I hope that many of the things I'm going to talk through today are slightly more proportionate than what you might have expected from the early rhetoric that has come out in some of the early reporting. Now, some of these requirements fall upon the trading venues to implement, and some upon the firms themselves, and all of those firms who now access the venues directly will actually then have to be regulated entities themselves. And I think that actually is closing a fairly major loop within MiFID I, where actually anybody accessing those markets will now have to be regulated directly by the national competent authorities. Now, directly applicable to the exchanges will be the requirement that all venues implement coordinated circuit breakers, so that if we have a flash crash type event here in Europe, it's immediately communicated to the other venues, who can then decide whether they should then halt trading either in a particular stock or across the market more generally. And I think that type of mechanism, it may not exist today, but it's certainly going to exist post-MiFID II. Secondly, we obviously have given ESMA a mandate to develop new rules on minimum tick sizes. And while we're allowing for calibration in order to differentiate between different instruments, it is fairly important to us as parliamentarians that we actually see tick size as being a way of actually making the markets better rather than worse, and that we should actually have venues competing for customer satisfaction rather than actually what the smallest tick size is that they can get down to. The third requirement introduced in the Parliament's text, which directly affects trading venues, is actually going to affect the market participants quite substantially if it stays in the final text. And I say if it stays in the final text because I'm very hopeful that in the final process of the legislation it will be removed. I don't personally agree with it, but I'm going to suggest to you that a 500 millisecond delay, a minimum resting period, is actually going to be introduced if the Parliament's text actually prevails. Now, that seems like an eternity to most high-frequency trading strategies, but actually certain political groups in the party believe it is necessary, and that they believe that this will be a mechanism to slow the entire market down for the good of the long-term investors. Now, I've actually looked at a lot of evidence from various different research projects, particularly those carried out by the Foresight Project, and I'm absolutely convinced that all this is going to do is give those people operating HFT strategies more of an advantage rather than less, because they'll know how long orders have been resting for, they'll know exactly how stale the orders are, and be first in the queue to actually pick off the next round of orders. So I genuinely am convinced it is not a good idea, but actually it is in the Parliament's text as it currently stands. So we'll see where we get to at the end of this. I suspect 500 milliseconds will actually be the end to many strategies. It will just give a new set of strategies instead. Now, there is also a reason why HFT and the need to slow things down has become a real political agenda point in Brussels. It is because the large buy-side institutions, the long-term investors, have come to Brussels complaining that they feel as if they are actually in a difficult position. Now, I would like to see that if anybody wants to come and complain to the legislators, that the first point of call should have been the venues themselves that they're using. If they actually have a complaint about the way that the venues are operating, I'd like to think they can talk to you as customers. That would be, I would have thought, the first point of call. But they have been very active in Brussels. And I think it's fairly important for us to actually recognise that spreads have tightened. Long-term investors have benefited from much of the technology out there. And we have to make sure that even though we have some evidence out there, many of the policymakers have actually not bought the arguments on liquidity. They've not actually bought the arguments even on the tightening of spreads. But when you think about these terms, they are financial terms. And so for the layperson, it's actually quite difficult to understand why that speed is so important. And certainly in Brussels, those messages have not got through to the parliamentarians yet. Now, as somebody who believes in market solutions, I really would like to think that you can actually do a better job in serving your customers rather than us doing it through legislation. So there are many things that I think as venue operators you can do to limit the activities of certain strategies that some of your larger customers might actually be finding, certainly perceiving to be detrimental to them. And I think the real key area within MiFID II that the Parliament has concentrated on is actually the fee structures that are being used at trading venues. and whether there is a real problem with certain people benefiting from certain fee structures or not. There is a perception out there that certain strategies are benefiting, and therefore I think the fee structures will need to be overhauled. And I think it's going to be important that within the final text there will be, where appropriate, market-making obligations. There will be higher fees imposed upon participants with high order to cancellation ratios, and those operating HFT strategies will have a higher burden. If they actually put a higher burden on the venue systems, then they should be paying proportionately higher cost for trading. But none of these points within the text as it stands, and I hope in the final text, is supposed to be overly prescriptive. It really is supposed to allow each venue to tailor the requirements for what is right for their market, what is right for their customers, hopefully ending up with what is a proportionate solution for the benefit of all the market users. And that's where we're coming to at the moment, is proportionate, and making sure that the venues have the ultimate control within the guidelines that the legislation will give. Now, the majority of the requirements in MiFID that apply to the investment firms themselves are typically about the relationship between the regulators and the firms. And following the US flash crash, it was very important to look at what Europe would have done if we'd had to reconstruct the order books in a quick manner. And I suspect we wouldn't be able to do it very efficiently. It took the CFTC and the SEC certainly a number of months to actually get 80% of the order book actually recreated. I don't think we would even be able to do that as it currently stands with the current data and the current recordings that we have. Therefore, I think we need to put in place mechanisms by which, if the regulator needs to see the order book, that the firms themselves are required to keep a full audit trail of raw data for a defined period of time. And so the onus will be on the firms to be able to prove what they did at a particular time. And so the data will be collected and, as appropriate, will be requested by a regulator, and in this case is most likely to be the National Competent Authority. Now, this all fits in with something I alluded to earlier, which is that there's a perception, both by market participants and regulators, that faster, more technology-driven markets are prone